A couple of months ago, we were asked to do a survey on the narcotics problem in connection with a program to attempt to curb this difficulty in our community. And I'd like to discuss with you this morning some phases of the subject which could not, in a practical way, be included in a survey for the purpose intended. As the problem may get nearer to us than we realize, I think perhaps we should give it some careful thought. The average person is fairly well fortified against the danger of narcotic addiction. But at this time, the extraordinary diversity of pharmaceuticals now distributed for various purposes and various reasons, many of which do contain narcotic materials or derivatives therefrom, and the stress of the time in which we live, these together may cause individuals to come under some measure of addiction without even knowing it. And while, of course, we do not like to think that that bottle of aspirin represents anything, we may be taking 2 or 3 extra cups of coffee. We may be using various so-called soft drink beverages which contain materials considered stimulating. These minor fringe narcotics are coming rather close to the lives of many people. Perhaps one of the most difficult to cope with is the possibility of certain habit-forming materials appearing in soft drinks which may even be given to children. Now, this doesn't intend to be a frightening presentation, but I think it's something we should keep in mind every day as our own tensions rise and the need for some type of release from tension comes very close to our personal living. Narcotic addiction in this country broadly divides into 2 classifications. One is the adult addict, and the other is the juvenile addict. I've been trying to get some kind of satisfactory figures as to the number of addicts which we probably have in the United States at this time. Formal reports vary from 50,000 to 80,000. But I have a very definite feeling that these reports are not really accurate. I suspect strongly that addiction is greater than we like to admit. And there's a great part of it never comes to public attention, possibly is fought out in the privacy of human lives. I would suspect that addiction will run from 50% to 100% above the generally published figures. This does not necessarily mean that we have an epidemic or a critical situation, but it does mean that the average person is subjected to contact with narcotic materials. And up to the present time, no satisfactory solution has been found to cope with the situation. Most experts agree that the only really satisfactory solution is a preventive program. Unless you have personally been in contact with narcotic addicts, as I have, it is difficult to imagine the dilemma in which they find themselves. A very large number of these addicts actually gain very little, even passing, personal satisfaction. The penalties are too heavy, the consequences too tragic. Yet the drug addict is in a very different situation from the average alcoholic. The alcoholic does respond to a skillful program of therapy in a large number of cases. And the marvelous work carried on by Alcoholics Anonymous has won worldwide respect. I might point out, however, that even in the alcohol bracket there is much more than may at first appear. The plight of the alcoholic is not limited by any means to what we might term Main Street problems. We are not dealing with the wino who has to have his cheap wine. We're not dealing with the frustrated, disappointed, impoverished alcoholic. Alcoholism has struck into practically every bracket of our national life. In one community, for example, there is at the present time a branch of Alcoholics Anonymous that handles nothing but alcoholic clergymen. Now, can you really face this situation? These men do not want to be alcoholic, but they have in one way or another gradually drifted into this situation. A number of prominent leaders in religious life have become alcoholics and in a few instances narcotic addicts, partly due to the tremendous pressure of their own programs, the type of work they are doing, the continual demand upon their mental and emotional energy, and an increasingly heavy responsibility denying them most of the normal relaxations and rests that people require to maintain adequate balance. We use alcoholism perhaps as a picture of our situation largely because it shows the immediate reaction of tension upon human habit. Now, alcohol has been a problem with humanity since the beginning of history. And it is just one of these interesting examples of how we can go a long way on the so-called roads of culture and civilization without correcting basic personal traits and characteristics. We are probably 1 million years old or more as human beings. I'm speaking now on a very conservative anthropological basis, which would be sustained by universities and by anthropologists. And yet, for instance, in this 1 million years of human development, the average person has not yet reached that state of civilization in which he can control a temper fit. This is pretty tragic. We have done nothing practically to end jealousy. We have done very little to end the ruthless ambitions and highly competitive attitudes of so-called prominent people. We are not speaking of the great problems at the moment, although these stem from these so-called roots in human character. It seems terrible that we have not been able to solve the problem of war. But this is a very massive situation, and most individuals feel completely unable to cope with war. Yet the average person who does not believe in war and does not want war is still unable to prevent himself from arguing with his own neighbors. There is this tremendous immediate participation of people in tension situations. And wherever tension rises in critical periods, we find this situation becoming intensified. We know that among most primitive peoples, both alcohol and the narcotic groups were essentially originally, strangely enough, part of religious custom. Most of our so-called narcotics can be traced in their development to the religious beliefs of ancient peoples. The purpose of the narcotic being to create a state of consciousness or an interior transformation of being, where by intensity or even by hallucination the individual seemed to be able to contact another dimension of the universe. We know that in early times the church itself was accused of drugging the communion cup. We know these things happened. We're not at all proud of them, and we feel that it is high time that many of these ills be corrected. But at the present time, the average person is not seriously interested in correcting problems. Therefore, instead of using his own abilities to solve his dilemmas, he is leaning more and more heavily upon escapes. And of course, both alcohol and narcotics constitute escape mechanisms. In this country, the adult narcotic addict has perhaps a 20 to 30% chance of recovery. Some will say that this is a negative or pessimistic point of view. But explorations and experimentations and groups formed to cope with the narcotic problem all come to the same general agreement, namely that the results are very inadequate, unsatisfactory, and unpredictable. The narcotic addict seemingly is more damaged more rapidly than the alcoholic. And while the chronic alcoholic can be a problem to himself, his family, and his world, the narcotic addict becomes a more immediate problem and a more desperate one in a comparatively short length of time. A narcotic is often confused with a stimulant. We have the idea that certain drugs put the individual to sleep and others wake him up. While it is true that so-called basic stimulants can be and are available, the majority of so-called stimulants are actually themselves narcotics. In other words, they achieve an appearance of stimulation by drugging some part of the mental emotional nature. The so-called stimulant effect is simply the individual's release from the barrier of his own natural inhibitions. A person in full control of his faculties is influenced strongly by tradition, by circumstances around him, by his social standing, by his community responsibilities, by his religious convictions, and by his economic interests. He therefore has a tendency to protect himself against any attitude or action which is liable to damage him socially or economically. Under the influence of so-called narcotics, however, those faculties which have to do with the direction and control of energy are reduced in their effectiveness. That part of the individual which is guardian over the rest is the part that goes to sleep, or at least is benumbed, or its effectiveness reduced. As a result of that, the individual suddenly finds release from discipline, from the discipline of himself. This release is the type of release that is fully and completely enjoyed by an adolescent. This is the type of freedom, not now necessarily freedom from the domination of other people, but freedom from the dominion of self. This freedom constitutes a means or an occasion for a tremendous release of subthreshold energies. The individual no longer under control becomes animated. He is animated, however, always on a lower level than that of his control. If he was actually completely integrated as a psychic being, he probably would act the same under a narcotic that he does while he is fully conscious. But as each person is in conflict with himself, and his very motives for becoming addicted to some form of stimulant is itself related to this. It simply follows that the person begins to reduce his barriers, and this in turn lowers the level of his psychic function. Under the alcohol, or even under certain narcotics, he is subject to delusion of grandeur, delusion of freedom, delusion of importance. He is allowed to express many secret impulses and instincts which under normal conditions he would regard as unpleasant or at least ridiculous. But once he has lowered these barriers, especially if he is in the company of other persons equally ridiculous, his attitudes seem to him to be adequate and an escape from some heavy responsibility or heavy duty or heavy decision which he feels he cannot properly carry. I think that both alcoholism and narcotic addiction have a certain relationship to the incredible increase in the tempo of modern industry and economics. A great number of alcoholics, and I strongly suspect from cases that I have considered, a number of narcotic addicts, are persons who are trying to keep pace with an economic situation which is beyond their ability to face squarely and honorably. Under the pressure of executive managements and under the general theory of the high competition of our time, individuals are expected to produce more, achieve more, bear more, work more in certain areas than is reasonable or proper for them. Now, this does not necessarily so strongly affect ordinary physical laborers as executive brackets. The executive is expected to produce. If he does not produce, he is replaced. Within reason, an executive is presumed to have abilities to produce. But he cannot possibly keep a tempo in which his own needs, his own limitations, his own health are of no interest whatever to those for whom he works. They are interested only in what he accomplishes. And if accomplishing tears him apart, he is expendable and replaceable. This situation goes further, however, in modern industry. Our modern economic situation is in one of the most ridiculous states that it is possible to imagine. It is no longer sufficient for an individual to know his business. It is no longer possible for business to be normally transacted in office hours under proper situations. Today, business is a curious combination of high-pressure salesmanship and high-pressure social activity. The successful man, particularly in a critical spot in an industry, is expected to please every potential customer and to have every weakness of the man he is trying to sell to. As a result of that, more and more business is being transacted at bars and clubs. And today, a young executive who declines to be an alcoholic will probably be replaced on that ground alone. He is simply not permitted to be in industry in a key situation if he is going to embarrass those with whom he is associated. And if the customer drinks, the salesman had better drink, so that they'll both be alcoholics together. Now, with more and more business being transacted in this manner, and ever greater dependence upon the credit card and its privileges, business today is becoming a highly involved problem of lowering resistances by any possible means. This continued over a period of time is bound to have a detrimental effect upon health, and it is striking directly at young people in their 20s who are trying to find their way into industry today. The social life of our country is falling apart at the seams as far as anything important is concerned. Instead of social relationship being the basis of social improvement, it is now the fundamental prerequisite of wasting time. And in order to waste time and be bored to death, the individual nearly always finds it convenient to become partly unconscious. It is pretty difficult to be in full possession of your faculties and spend most of your time with people who are not. Today it is becoming a problem in young people establishing homes. It is a problem in all of our universities. It is a problem everywhere. As to some way of coping with this, we'll almost say, medicinal technique for being a bore. Well, that's what it approximately amounts to. Now, the general situation is further intensified by world conditions. The average person of a generation or two ago had a feeling that life was in some way rather important. Perhaps it was only important in terms of the very fundamental interests of human life. The average young person expected to grow up, go to work, build a home, and raise a family. He felt reasonably certain that if he turned in a good job, employment was secure. But after he got to be about 65 years old, he would be retired, they would give a banquet for him and present him with a standing clock. This was the usual procedure. Occasionally they varied it and gave him a reading lamp or something of that nature with a plaque on it. This plaque was important. Didn't mean anything, but it represented evidence of faithful service, faithfully given. And to a measure, this very simple pattern influenced this man's sons, who felt that respectability was largely in following father's footsteps. In the last 25 years, the world has become so neurotic in its reactions that there is no longer the possibility of pointing out to the average person the importance of maintaining the dignity of his own character, the importance of sustaining his own health, and the importance of protecting his life and the lives of others. These matters are no longer important. The individual feels that his future can end in little better than ulcers, and that there is an even probability that anything he builds up will be destroyed by war or by the unreasonable manipulation of finances which more or less distinguish our times. Between war and inflation, between the various pressures of debt and responsibility, the person does not feel that life is an adventure. To the average person, life is a sentence. It is a sentence to remain self-supporting as long as possible and then let the government take over. This situation is basically so bad that the possibility of handling it on the level of heart-to-heart talk with a person in trouble, the effort to stimulate some natural dignities, the attempt to point out the importance of clean living, these things just simply fall off. They are meaningless. The individual does not believe in his world. He does not believe in its policies. He does not believe in his own participation in it. Therefore, he is not particularly concerned with whether anyone is proud of him or not. Of course, this does not apply to everyone, but it applies to a continually increasing group that is already a substantial minority. And it is in this type of group that most of our difficult problems can be found. In the last several years, on the side of the juvenile problem, I have been called in connection with juvenile drug addiction. People have come to me with their stories. I've tried to gain my assistance in extricating a loved one, a child, from one of these situations. In 3 cases that came along one after the other in the course of about 6 months. The first point that the parent made in connection with the drug addiction of a child was total astonishment. They had no idea that the boy or girl was in trouble. They had no idea there was anything wrong. Everything apparently that was necessary, proper, and adequate was present. There was no economic need. The young person was not falling behind in studies. They apparently had an interesting life. The parent simply had no way of explaining it. It simply came as a bombshell that their boy or girl had suddenly been picked up as a narcotic. Going a little further into the problem, however, it was a little astonishing that a chain of circumstances which would lead to narcotic addiction was completely unknown to an observant parent. It just seems as though such things could not be. And as we went into the situation, it became obvious that we were not dealing with observant parents. We were dealing with individuals who in one way or another were totally unable to cope with their own children. One of the situations that was pointed out was that the child of today cannot be controlled. That the old controls that used to be adequate are no longer adequate. The girl of 14 wants to stay out till 2 o'clock in the morning. All her friends do. And all she will do if she's denied this privilege is come home and weep. She is being cruelly mistreated. Not too long ago, a girl that was not permitted to stay out until 2 o'clock in the morning committed suicide. Now, this is a rather confusing picture. But it does bespeak the importance of environment and of the general patterns of society upon the individual. Problem children, as one expert has said, are nearly always children with problems. And one of the problems of the modern child, and a lot of young people have come to me with this, is absolute lack of leadership on the part of parents. The parent is not leading. The parent does not attempt to lead until the child has developed so many bad habits that it can no longer be led. You cannot allow a child to do as it pleases until it is in trouble, and then suddenly assume a strong parental attitude. It's much too late and too little. The average family, I talked to the father of one of these boys that was in trouble. I said, what do you do in the family that is interesting? Do you enjoy reading good books? No. Do you go out with your children? Do you take them places and do things with them? Have them time? Do you have hobbies or crafts and share with these children? No. What do you do about their religious training? Oh, they go to church sometimes. And we found out that they went to church sometimes alone. The parent did not go. The parent's solution was this. It is hard enough to make a living today. We have to fight our own problems, and if we supply these young people with a good home, good food, good clothing, and an education, that's all we can do. But it apparently isn't enough. In surveying a group of narcotic juveniles not long ago, out of 10, a report came in that 8 admitted under questioning that they were living in broken or semi-broken homes, that there was no compatibility between the parents, no real effort to create a home. These young people were boarding in a house or an apartment, but they were not living in a home. The actual situation that might have created any strong relationship in the family was lacking. These young people were out, no one knew where. They would come back, no one knew when. They were doing, no one knew what. But it was assumed, for some mysterious reason, that because they came from a fairly respectable level, because they had a $20,000 or $30,000 home, because they were receiving the advantages of modern living, that these young people should work out their moral problems themselves, that they had every inducement to be good citizens. This is not actually true. These young people were lacking the one thing which is probably the only ultimate cure for juvenile narcotic addiction, and that is internal stamina. Now, what is this stamina? Is it something that can be shouted by the judge, or can be created by the probation officer, or will be developed into a magnificent maturity by 2 years in jail? The answer is no. It cannot be done in this way. Stamina consists of resource within the person, the natural and proper instinct to cling to what is good and to turn against what is not good. This stamina has nothing to do with education as we know it. This stamina has nothing to do with Greek and Latin. It has nothing to do with a degree in physics or atomic science. This stamina is something that has to be developed within the character of the child. And it takes a little thinking and a little work to do it. And where the work and the thinking begin, too many modern parents leave off. They are not concerned. I think our old friend Komensky, the great Moravian educator who created our public school system, I think he had the simple answer. That character is built before the child goes to school. And if the child's character is not established before it is 7 years old, it'll be a problem from then on out. Now, this problem does not necessarily mean it'll be a drug addict. But this child is going to be a difficult person in marriage. This child is going to be poorly adjusted in economics. This child will not use but will abuse friends. This child will have more wants than can reasonably be satisfied. This child will be more extravagant than the social position of the parents justifies. Now, how are we going to get this stamina in there? The answer is it has to start when the child is born. The child has to be given certain basic principles, stated as simply and naturally as possible. And one of these principles is pride in honor. And a child that is comparatively young can begin to appreciate the principles of right character, honesty, truthfulness, recognition of respect for parent, respect for government, respect for life. By the time the child is 6 or 7 years old, much has been accomplished. We know, for example, that juvenile delinquency is much less prominent in all its forms. Where children, for example, in early life have had pets. If a small child has a puppy dog, or a kitten, or the famous and familiar rabbit, or the famous and rapidly multiplying guinea pig, this situation causes the small child to have an experience of sympathy for living things. The helplessness, the friendliness, the happiness, the cuteness of this little animal brings sympathy out of the child. If, however, we wait too long until the delinquency factor is too prominent, then we have children that will torture animals. It has to do with getting started early. It has to do with getting started as soon as comprehension is possible. And as Comenius points out very clearly, you cannot appeal to the intellectual maturity of a 5-year-old child. You cannot explain to this child the operations of parliamentary procedure, nor can you satisfactorily warn this child of the danger of prison, punishment, or anything of this nature. The child doesn't live in that kind of a world. Therefore, Kaminsky points out there's one thing you can always depend on, however, and that is that the child will copy the person he loves and will imitate the character of the individual he respects. Therefore, the greatest way of instructing the young is example. Simple example. Example of true friendliness and understanding between parents. If this is impossible due to circumstances over which one of the parents has no control, then this one parent who understands must try in every way possible to still maintain this mood or this creativity. I know one young man who left home at 16 and became a criminal. He came from a divided family. But this is not the most important thing. The person he was living with spent 90% of their time condemning, criticizing, and berating the absent parent. The hatred of the parent he was living with was so intense that the young man finally left home simply to get away from hatred. By that time, however, his own character was badly damaged. So the prevention of most of our problems lies in example and early indoctrination. Example, we're bringing religion into the life of the small child. A quiet time together, an evening prayer. These things help to create in children values which will go on to support them when they get in high school or college and suddenly find themselves among young people whose characters or morals are not what they should be. So the beginning of all prevention in the line and level of the juvenile must be in the home where the problem begins. And it is far better, as many experts have pointed out, for the family to simplify its living. It is absolutely not necessary, and never has been necessary, for a child to be brought up in a $50,000 home if the parents can't afford it. Nor has it been necessary that this child have its own swimming pool or its own automobile at 16. These are not the necessities of life. If in order to maintain this level, the parents have to neglect the child, it is better for them to move down to a level where they can live comfortably within their means and devote more attention to their children. You bring this home to the parent, however, and in all too many instances you discover that the parent is a status seeker themselves and that the child is being sacrificed to this. So we have these situations for which very little in a legislative way can be accomplished. Every possible means can be used to deter the narcotic addict, particularly the juvenile. And in educational institutions where adequate enlightenment on this subject has been brought to the children early, there is a notable decrease, but not an extinction of the difficulty. Also, it is quite true that due to the important, confused state of modern society, children should be taught the basic principles of character and adjustment much earlier than has previously been considered necessary. Today, a child needs to know how to live just about as soon as it needs to learn the multiplication table. We give up any hope of their ever learning the alphabet. This is practically out. But we can have hope that they will develop certain basic characteristics. So we have this situation that much of our delinquency arises in our concept of what is a good home, What is a proper attitude of the parent? Now, the parent is not always, by any means, intentionally to blame. He is unable to cope with the situation himself. But when a parent is unable to cope with the problems arising in a family, it is not unreasonable to assume that the children in that family cannot cope with them either. And that simply to bury the problem, or to hide it, or to forget it, will never solve anything. Actually, we are here in this world to learn. And one of the things that people learn, and must learn, is the management of family. And unless this is taken on in a more serious manner, we're going to have the continuation of this problem. We cannot substitute a busy, successful career for family. Actually, there is no particular advantage in it from a psychological standpoint. Career is important, and many individuals need a certain amount of authority and executive responsibility for the development of their own characters. But all of these people will be healthier if they know when to close the door of the office, when to go home and have a family relationship with those who are close to them. This is a balance which is tremendously necessary. If a man moves out of the problems of an office only into the problems of a home, he is nowhere. And he gradually becomes of little social value to his own family, and little inspiration or consolation to them. Our addiction problem is arising among young people from the very same roots as nearly all other discontents. And it is this very same type of situation that leads to private iconoclasm, where the young person becomes disillusioned, and whether they develop any other bad habits or not, this habit of cynical reaction to life is bad in itself. There is the lack of warmth and understanding. And most young people that I have discussed drug addiction with have declared themselves to be primarily lonely, with no opportunity to share value with anybody. Therefore, substituting for this sharing of value whatever thrills can come along. Unless we gear some part of our culture to the protection of our young, we're going to have trouble. And this goes to entertainment, television, all of these things. As long as the young person is merely considered as present, and it is assumed that any commercial project can go its merry way regardless of what it does to him, as long as this attitude continues, we are going to be in a serious situation. And as this serious situation gradually unfolds to the maturity of these neglected entities, we're going to have world problems and more difficult situations than we have ever faced before. In most of the treatment on the subject of narcotics, the principal problem has been how to curb or control the availability of narcotic drugs. This is also a very important thing. But in many parts of the world, narcotic plants are grown publicly and with legal sanction. The theory underneath it being, of course, that a certain amount of narcotic material is necessary in the practice of medicine. This is true, and there's no use penalizing human suffering in order to curb a situation. There are cases in which narcotics are a blessing, and they are necessary. And I don't think anyone would want to go back to the time in the 17th century, in Holland, for example, where after a battle, wounded men were herded together or carried on stretchers, and their legs were sawed off without an anesthetic, and the stump was cauterized with a red-hot iron. I don't think we want that back. On the other hand, we also know that the amount of narcotic material legally produced in the world is far in excess of the medical requirement. And this, of course, does not take into consideration that type of narcotic which is illicitly produced or grown in areas where control and research are impossible.